Welcome. Tonight, we begin our journey through the history of New York City by traveling back to a time before the city existed. Long before skyscrapers rose above Manhattan, before bridges crossed the rivers, and before millions of people called this place home, the land looked entirely different. Imagine standing on the shores of Manhattan hundreds of years ago. There are no buildings, no streets, no traffic, no city at all. Instead, forests stretch in every direction. Streams wind through valleys. Birds fly overhead, and the sound of waves gently reaches the shoreline. This is Manhattan before New York. To understand the city that would eventually grow here, we first need to understand the land itself. The story begins thousands of years ago during the last ice age. At that time, much of North America was covered by enormous glaciers. These massive sheets of ice slowly moved across the landscape, carving valleys and reshaping the terrain beneath them. As the climate warmed, the glaciers retreated. They left behind rocky hills, rivers, wetlands, and the coastline that would eventually become New York Harbor. The island of Manhattan itself was shaped by these ancient forces. The rocky outcroppings still visible in parts of Central Park today are reminders of a landscape formed long before human history was recorded. Nature had already prepared the foundation for a future city. The geography of the region was remarkable. To the west flowed the Hudson River. To the east lay the waterway now known as the East River. To the south stretched a deep natural harbor opening toward the Atlantic Ocean. Together, these waterways created one of the finest harbors in North America. But centuries ago, these waters were not important because of commerce or shipping. They were important because they provided life. Long before Europeans arrived, the region was home to the Lenape people. The Lenape lived throughout the area that includes present-day New York City, northern New Jersey, and parts of Pennsylvania and Delaware. For generations, they had built communities connected to the land, rivers, forests, and seasons. The natural world provided nearly everything they needed. Fish filled the rivers. Shellfish lined the shores. Forests supplied game, nuts, berries, and wood. The Lenape understood the rhythms of the environment in extraordinary detail. They knew when fish would return to rivers. They knew where animals traveled during different seasons. They knew which plants could be used for food and medicine. Their knowledge had been passed down through countless generations. To them, this landscape was not wilderness. It was home. Throughout the year, many communities moved seasonally to take advantage of different resources. During warmer months, people often gathered near rivers and coastal areas where fishing was abundant. At other times, families traveled inland to hunt or harvest resources from the forests. This pattern helped sustain both the people and the land itself. Homes were typically built using wooden frames covered with bark or woven mats. These structures were practical and well suited to the local climate. Villages often contained several homes along with shared spaces where people worked, cooked, and gathered together. Life followed a steady and familiar rhythm. People fished. They farmed. They hunted. They raised children. They shared stories and traditions that connected them to their ancestors. As evening arrived, families gathered around fires while stories were told beneath a sky filled with stars. Without artificial lights, the night sky would have appeared brighter than most people can imagine today. The same stars that shine above New York now once shone over these quiet villages. The region was also connected by a network of trails and waterways. Rivers served as natural highways, allowing people to travel efficiently by canoe. Trade linked communities throughout the Northeast. Goods, tools, food, and decorative items moved between villages over great distances. One valuable material was wampum, made from shells gathered along the coast. Wampum played an important role in diplomacy, storytelling, and ceremonial exchanges. The harbor itself was rich with life. Oysters thrived in enormous numbers. Fish filled the waters. Birds nested along the shoreline. The ecosystem was healthy, diverse, and abundant. The harbor that would someday become crowded with ships and ferries was once a thriving natural environment. If we could view Manhattan from above around the year 1500, it would look almost unrecognizable. Dense forests covered much of the island. Wetlands bordered sections of the coast. Streams flowed toward the rivers. Wildflowers bloomed in open meadows. The island was alive with plants, animals, and the steady rhythms of nature. Yet despite all this activity, there was also a remarkable sense of quiet. No engines, no construction, no sirens, only wind moving through the trees, birdsong in the distance, water flowing toward the sea, and the sounds of everyday life in Lenape communities. For thousands of years, the landscape changed slowly. Generations were born, raised families, and passed their knowledge to those who followed. The forests remained. The rivers continued their journey toward the ocean. The harbor endured. But change was approaching from across the Atlantic. European explorers had begun searching for new trade routes and opportunities. Ships would soon sail into these waters. Maps would be redrawn. The future of Manhattan would begin to change. Yet for now, as the sun sets over the harbor, the island remains peaceful. The forests glow in the fading light. The rivers reflect the colors of the evening sky. And Manhattan, still untouched by the city it will one day become, settles quietly into the night. As we continue our journey through the history of New York City, we leave behind the quiet forests and waterways of ancient Manhattan and turn our attention across the Atlantic Ocean. The year is 1609. The island we now know as Manhattan remains largely unchanged. Thick forests cover the land. Rivers and streams flow freely toward the harbor. Lenape communities continue their daily routines, hunting, fishing, farming, and traveling along waterways that have sustained life for generations. Far away in Europe, however, merchants and explorers are searching for something that has fascinated them for decades, a faster route to Asia. Goods such as spices, silk, and porcelain were highly valuable in Europe. Reaching Asian markets was difficult, expensive, and time-consuming. Many believed there must be a shorter route across the globe. Among the men searching for that route was an English navigator named Henry Hudson. By 1609, Hudson was already an experienced sailor. He had spent years exploring northern waters and searching for a passage that would connect Europe to Asia. This time, he was sailing for Dutch merchants who hoped to expand their trading opportunities. Hudson was given command of a ship called the Half Moon. Compared to modern ships, the Half Moon was quite small. Life aboard was cramped. Crew members slept in tight quarters, ate simple meals, and endured weeks at sea with no certainty about what lay ahead. In the spring of 1609, the vessel left Europe and crossed the Atlantic Ocean. For weeks, the crew saw little but water and sky. Days blended together as sailors adjusted sails, maintained the ship, and watched the horizon. At night, navigators used the stars to help determine their position. Eventually, the coast of North America appeared. Hudson began exploring the shoreline, searching for rivers and waterways that might lead inland. Every bay and inlet offered the possibility of becoming the passage he sought. Then, in September of 1609, the Half Moon entered one of the finest natural harbors in North America. Imagine standing on the deck as the ship approaches. Ahead stretches a broad harbor surrounded by forests. The shoreline is untouched by buildings. Hills rise gently in the distance. Small islands dot the water. There are no skyscrapers, no bridges, no city, only nature. To Hudson and his crew, the harbor must have seemed both beautiful and promising. After entering the harbor, the expedition sailed north into a wide river. Today, that river bears Hudson's name. For several days, the crew continued upriver, hoping they had finally discovered a route leading toward Asia. Around every bend, there was anticipation that the river might open into a passage beyond the continent. But as they traveled farther inland, it became clear that this was not the shortcut they had been seeking. The river was magnificent, but it did not lead to the Pacific Ocean. Even so, Hudson's voyage would prove enormously important. The river and harbor offered something almost as valuable as a route to Asia. They provided access to a region rich in natural resources and ideal for trade. Throughout the journey, Hudson's crew encountered indigenous communities living along the river and coastline. Some interactions involved trade and the exchange of goods. Both groups were encountering people from very different cultures and traditions. Communication was often difficult, and neither side could fully understand how these first meetings would shape the future. The region left a strong impression on Hudson and his sponsors. The harbor was deep and sheltered. The surrounding lands appeared fertile. Rivers provided access far into the interior. Most importantly, the area offered opportunities for trade, particularly in animal furs, which were highly valued in European markets. After several weeks of exploration, Hudson turned the Half Moon southward. The ship eventually returned across the Atlantic, carrying reports about the remarkable harbor and river system that had been discovered. Although Hudson had failed to find a passage to Asia, he had accomplished something else. He had introduced Dutch merchants to a place with tremendous commercial potential. Within a few years, traders would begin returning to the region. Small trading posts would appear. Relationships would develop between European merchants and indigenous communities. Slowly, a permanent presence would begin to take shape. The quiet shores of Manhattan were changing, not all at once, and not dramatically at first. The forests still stood. The rivers still flowed. The Lenape continued their daily lives. Yet the arrival of the Half Moon marked the beginning of a new chapter in the region's history, a chapter that would eventually lead to the founding of a small Dutch settlement called New Amsterdam, and from that settlement, centuries later, would emerge one of the most famous cities in the world. As the sun sets over the harbor and the sails of the Half Moon disappear beyond the horizon, we leave the year 1609 behind. Although Hudson failed to find a passage to Asia, his journey introduced Dutch merchants to a region filled with opportunity. Over the years that followed, traders began returning to these shores. At first, their visits were temporary. Small groups arrived to exchange goods with indigenous communities before sailing back across the Atlantic. The most valuable commodity was animal fur, especially beaver pelts, which were highly sought after in Europe. Fashion trends at the time had created a strong demand for felt hats made from beaver fur. As a result, merchants saw tremendous potential in the forests and waterways of the region. What began as seasonal trading soon evolved into something more permanent. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a colony known as New Netherland. Its purpose was straightforward: expand trade, strengthen Dutch influence, and generate profit. The colony stretched across a large area surrounding the Hudson River, but one location quickly became especially important: the southern tip of Manhattan Island. There, near the harbor, settlers established a small community that became known as New Amsterdam. At first, it was little more than a frontier outpost. A handful of buildings stood near the waterfront. Wooden homes, warehouses, and simple docks lined the shoreline. The settlement was small enough that a person could walk across much of it in only a few minutes. Yet its location offered significant advantages. Ships arriving from Europe could easily enter the harbor. Rivers provided access to inland trading routes. The surrounding waters offered protection from storms. For merchants, it was an ideal place to conduct business. Life in New Amsterdam revolved around trade. Ships arrived carrying tools, cloth, household goods, and supplies from Europe. They departed carrying valuable cargo gathered from the colony and surrounding regions. The waterfront was often the busiest part of town. Workers unloaded barrels, crates, and supplies while merchants negotiated prices and organized shipments. Although the settlement remained small, it was surprisingly diverse. People arrived from various parts of Europe, bringing different languages, customs, and traditions. Dutch was the primary language of government and commerce, but many other languages could also be heard along the streets and docks. This diversity would become a lasting characteristic of New York City. Even in its earliest days, New Amsterdam was a place where people from different backgrounds lived and worked together. One of the most famous stories associated with this period involves the purchase of Manhattan. In 1626, Dutch official Peter Minuit negotiated an agreement with local indigenous people for rights to the land. Over the centuries, the event became widely known through the story that Manhattan was purchased for goods worth about $24. Modern historians note that the reality was likely much more complicated than the popular legend suggests. Different cultures often held very different ideas about land ownership and agreements. Regardless of the details, the story became one of the most famous episodes in early New York history. As the settlement grew, additional structures appeared. Homes were built from wood and stone. Gardens supplied food for residents. Livestock grazed in open areas beyond the settlement. Paths gradually connected different parts of the community. What would someday become one of the world's busiest cities still looked more like a small village. The natural environment remained close at hand. Forests covered much of Manhattan. Wildlife could be found just beyond the edges of town. Streams flowed through the landscape, and the harbor continued to provide abundant resources. Residents depended heavily on the surrounding environment for food, fuel, and building materials. Daily life was often challenging. Winters could be harsh. Supplies sometimes arrived slowly from Europe. Settlers had to construct homes, maintain defenses, and adapt to life in a new environment. Yet many remained optimistic about the colony's future. Trade continued to grow. More settlers arrived. The town gradually expanded. By the 1640s and 1650s, New Amsterdam had become the center of Dutch activity in North America. Its streets remained narrow and unpaved. Many buildings were modest in size. But compared to its earliest years, the settlement was becoming a busy and active community. Visitors arriving by ship would have seen a collection of rooftops clustered near the harbor. Smoke rose from chimneys. Small boats moved across the water. Workers carried goods along the docks. The sounds of conversation echoed through the growing town. Despite its modest appearance, New Amsterdam was laying the foundations for something much larger. The harbor that attracted Dutch traders would later attract merchants from around the world. The diversity already visible in the settlement would become one of New York's defining characteristics. And the small waterfront village would continue to grow beyond anything its founders could have imagined. As evening settles over New Amsterdam, lanterns begin to glow inside homes and taverns. The harbor grows quiet. Ships rest at their docks. Families gather indoors after a day of work. The settlement remains small, but its future is beginning to take shape. We leave the docks and trading posts of New Amsterdam and take a closer look at everyday life in the small Dutch settlement growing at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. By the middle of the 17th century, New Amsterdam was no longer just a trading outpost. It had become a community where people worked, raised families, built homes, and planned for the future. Even so, it remained a very small town by modern standards. Only a few hundred people lived there during its early years. If you were to walk through New Amsterdam on a quiet morning, the scene would feel very different from modern New York City. There were no skyscrapers, no traffic lights, no subways, no crowded avenues filled with millions of people. Instead, narrow dirt roads wound between modest homes and small businesses. Chickens wandered freely. Livestock grazed in open fields. Wooden fences marked gardens and property lines. The pace of life was slow and closely connected to the natural world. Most people woke shortly after sunrise. Without electricity, daylight was valuable. Work often began early and continued until evening. Many families grew vegetables in small gardens beside their homes. Cabbage, onions, carrots, beans, and other crops helped provide food throughout the year. Some residents kept animals such as chickens, pigs, or goats. Food was often simple but filling. Bread was a staple of daily life. People also ate fish, meat, vegetables, soups, and stews. Fresh food depended heavily on the season and on what was available locally. Water came from wells or nearby streams. Preparing meals required considerable time and effort compared to modern life. Many homes were built using wood, although some wealthier residents constructed houses from stone or brick. Inside, furnishings were modest. A family might have a table, benches, storage chests, cooking tools, and a few personal possessions. Fireplaces served as an important source of both heat and cooking. During the cold winters, families often gathered near the hearth for warmth. Despite the challenges of frontier life, residents worked hard to create comfortable homes. Children played games, learned practical skills, and helped with household chores. From a young age, boys and girls were expected to contribute to daily life. Some helped care for animals. Others carried water, gathered firewood, or assisted with cooking and gardening. Formal education existed but was limited. Schools were small, and not every child attended regularly. Many practical lessons were learned at home through observation and experience. Religion also played an important role in the community. The Dutch Reformed Church was influential in New Amsterdam, and church services were a regular part of life for many residents. The church served not only as a place of worship, but also as a gathering place where neighbors could meet and share news. One of the most interesting aspects of New Amsterdam was its diversity. Although it was a Dutch colony, people from many different backgrounds lived there. Settlers arrived from various parts of Europe. Some spoke Dutch, while others spoke German, French, English, or other languages. The town also included free and enslaved Africans, who played important roles in building and maintaining the colony. As a result, New Amsterdam became one of the most culturally diverse settlements in North America. This diversity would later become one of New York City's defining characteristics. The marketplace was often the center of activity. Farmers, merchants, and traders gathered to buy and sell goods. Fresh produce, fish, meat, tools, fabrics, and imported items from Europe could all be found in the bustling market area. News traveled quickly through these gatherings. People discussed arriving ships, weather conditions, trade opportunities, and events taking place elsewhere in the colony. The waterfront remained the economic heart of the settlement. Ships regularly arrived carrying supplies from Europe and other colonies. Workers unloaded cargo, while merchants recorded inventories and negotiated transactions. For many residents, the harbour represented opportunity. It connected their small settlement to a much larger world. Outside the town, Manhattan remained largely undeveloped. Forests covered much of the island. Wild animals could still be found nearby. Residents often gathered firewood, hunted game, or explored areas beyond the settlement's boundaries. Nature was never far away. At night, the town became quiet. Without electric lights, darkness arrived quickly after sunset. Lanterns and candles provided limited illumination inside homes. Outside, the streets grew dim and peaceful. The sounds of conversation gradually faded. The harbour became calm. Families settled indoors after long days of work. Above them, countless stars filled the night sky. For the people of New Amsterdam, life was not always easy. There were harsh winters, uncertain harvests, and the challenges that came with living in a young colony. Yet there were also moments of community, celebration, and hope. Neighbors helped one another. Families built lives together. Children grew up knowing a town that, though small, was steadily growing. Few residents could have imagined what Manhattan would someday become. The village around them seemed permanent enough, yet it remained tiny compared to the city that would eventually rise in its place. The forests still stretched across much of the island. The harbour still reflected the stars at night, and New Amsterdam remained a modest settlement at the edge of a vast continent. As evening settles over the town, smoke drifts gently from chimneys and lanterns glow in the windows of homes. The day's work is finished. The streets grow quiet, and the small Dutch settlement rests beneath the night sky. For several decades, the small Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam continued to grow at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Ships arrived regularly from Europe. Merchants traded goods along the waterfront. Farmers worked the surrounding land, and families built their lives in the young colony. Although New Amsterdam remained relatively small, it occupied an important location. Its harbour connected the Atlantic Ocean to the interior of North America through the Hudson River. As trade increased, so did interest from other European powers. Among them was England. During the 17th century, the Dutch and English frequently competed for influence, territory, and trade opportunities around the world. Colonies were valuable assets, and both nations hoped to expand their reach. By the 1660s, English leaders had begun looking closely at New Netherland, the Dutch colony that included New Amsterdam. From the English perspective, the colony sat in an awkward location. To the north were English settlements in New England. To the south were English colonies along the Atlantic coast. New Netherland occupied the space between them. In 1664, the English decided to act. That summer, several English warships sailed into New York Harbor and anchored near New Amsterdam. For the residents of the town, the sight must have been unsettling. The settlement was not heavily defended, and many citizens worried about the consequences of resistance. When the English demanded the colony's surrender, Dutch Governor Peter Stuyvesant initially wanted to fight. Stuyvesant was known for his strong personality and determination. He believed the colony should defend itself. Many residents, however, saw little chance of success. The English force was larger and better prepared. Merchants feared the disruption that conflict might bring to trade and daily life. After discussions among local leaders and residents, the decision was made to surrender peacefully. In September of 1664, New Amsterdam officially came under English control. Remarkably, the transition occurred with very little violence. The town's residents were largely allowed to keep their property, continue their businesses, and practice their religions. For many people, daily life changed less dramatically than one might expect. The most visible change was the town's name. New Amsterdam became New York. The colony was named in honor of the Duke of York, the brother of England's King Charles II. The name would remain, eventually becoming known throughout the world. Although English rule had begun, traces of Dutch influence remained everywhere. Many residents continued speaking Dutch. Dutch customs persisted within families and communities. Dutch place names survived on maps and in local traditions. Even today, some neighborhoods, streets, and place names in New York reflect the city's Dutch origins. Under English control, the colony continued to grow. The harbor remained busy. Trade expanded. New settlers arrived from Europe and neighboring colonies. Merchants found opportunities in shipping, commerce, and agriculture. The population slowly increased year after year. The town itself also began to spread beyond its earliest boundaries. New homes appeared. Businesses expanded. Roads improved. Areas that had once been fields or forests gradually became part of the growing settlement. One reminder of the town's earlier years could be found along its northern edge. During Dutch rule, a wooden defensive wall had been built to help protect the settlement. The wall marked the edge of the town and served as a barrier against potential threats. Over time, the wall lost its military importance and was eventually removed. Yet the roadway that developed along its path survived. Today, that street is known as Wall Street. What began as a simple defensive structure would eventually lend its name to one of the world's most famous financial districts. Throughout the late 17th century, New York became increasingly connected to the wider Atlantic world. Ships carried goods, news, and people between Europe, the Caribbean, and the American colonies. The harbor's excellent location continued to attract merchants and traders. Every arriving vessel brought new opportunities and new influences. The city was becoming more diverse with each passing year. People from different backgrounds settled there, bringing their languages, traditions, and skills. This mixture of cultures helped shape the character of the growing town. By the end of the century, New York was no longer merely a small Dutch outpost. It had become an important English colonial port with a promising future. Few residents could have predicted just how significant the city would become. The streets were still narrow. Much of Manhattan remained undeveloped. Forests and open land could still be found beyond the settled areas. Yet the foundations of a great city were beginning to emerge. The harbor that had attracted Dutch traders was now drawing merchants from across the Atlantic. The settlement that had once consisted of only a handful of buildings was steadily growing into a regional center of commerce. As evening falls over New York in the late 1600s, lanterns flicker in windows overlooking the harbor. Ships rest quietly at their docks. Merchants finish their accounts for the day. Families gather indoors as darkness settles across the town. The Dutch era has come to an end, but its legacy remains woven into the fabric of the growing city. And New York's story is only just beginning. As the 17th century came to a close, New York was no longer a small Dutch settlement on the edge of the wilderness. Now under English rule, the city continued to grow as ships arrived from across the Atlantic carrying goods, news, and new residents. The 18th century would bring prosperity, change, and eventually revolution. But for much of this period, daily life in New York followed a steady rhythm centered on trade and the harbor. Each morning, the waterfront came alive. Merchants opened their businesses. Sailors unloaded cargo. Dockworkers moved barrels, crates, and bundles from ships arriving from Europe, the Caribbean, and other American colonies. The harbor had become the city's greatest asset. Its location made New York an ideal place for commerce. Goods from distant places passed through the city every day. Sugar from the Caribbean, manufactured products from Europe, timber, grain, and furs from North America. As trade expanded, so did the population. More homes were built. New streets appeared. The town slowly spread northward beyond its earliest boundaries. Although still small by modern standards, New York was becoming one of the most important ports in Britain's American colonies. Walking through the city in the early 1700s, you would find a mixture of cultures and languages. English was the language of government, but many residents still spoke Dutch. Other settlers arrived from Germany, France, Scotland, and elsewhere. This diversity remained one of the city's defining characteristics. Markets were busy gathering places where people bought food, exchanged news, and conducted business. Fresh produce arrived from nearby farms. Fish and shellfish came from local waters. Merchants sold imported goods that connected New Yorkers to the wider world. Coffee houses also became popular. More than places to enjoy a warm drink, they served as centers of conversation. Merchants gathered to discuss shipping schedules, trade opportunities, and current events. News from London or other colonies often spread through these meeting places. Long before smartphones, newspapers, or radio broadcasts, information traveled through conversations like these. Daily life varied depending on a person's occupation and social status. Merchants often enjoyed comfortable homes and financial success. Craftsmen worked as blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, tailors, and shipbuilders. Laborers performed physically demanding work along the docks and construction sites. Women managed households, raised children, and often contributed to family businesses. Children frequently began working at an early age, helping support their families. Enslaved Africans also made up a significant part of New York's population during the colonial era. They worked in homes, businesses, farms, and along the waterfront. Their labor contributed greatly to the growth and success of the city, even though they were denied freedom and many basic rights. As the decades passed, New York continued to prosper. New buildings rose throughout the town. Church steeples became familiar features of the skyline. Ships crowded the harbor. Visitors increasingly viewed New York as a thriving center of trade and opportunity. Yet beneath the prosperity, tensions were beginning to develop between Britain and its American colonies. For many years, colonists had generally accepted British rule. However, after the costly 7 Years' War ended in 1763, the British government sought new ways to raise revenue. A series of taxes and regulations soon followed. Many colonists believed these measures were unfair. One complaint became especially common. The colonies were being taxed by a government in which they had no elected representation. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," began appearing throughout the colonies. In New York, these debates often played out in taverns, coffee houses, and public meeting places. Merchants worried about the impact of new taxes on trade. Citizens discussed political developments with growing concern. The city became an important center of colonial resistance. One notable gathering place was the area known as the Commons, where residents assembled to hear speeches and discuss current events. As disagreements with Britain intensified, New Yorkers found themselves increasingly divided. Some supported greater independence from British rule. Others remained loyal to the Crown and believed the colonies should remain part of the British Empire. Families, neighbors, and friends sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of the debate. Despite these tensions, everyday life continued. Ships still arrived in the harbor. Markets remained busy. Children attended school and completed chores. People married, raised families, and pursued their livelihoods. History often remembers major events, but most people spent their days focused on ordinary concerns. Then came the events of the 1770s. Political disagreements gradually transformed into open conflict. In 1775, fighting broke out between colonial forces and British troops. The American Revolution had begun. Because of its strategic location and excellent harbor, New York quickly became one of the most important places in the war. Both sides recognized its value. In 1776, British forces captured the city after a series of military campaigns. For much of the Revolution, New York remained under British control. Thousands of soldiers, sailors, refugees, and civilians crowded the city. Life became more difficult as the war continued. Resources were strained, and uncertainty became part of daily life. Yet even during these challenging years, New Yorkers adapted as best they could. The harbor remained active. Businesses continued operating. Families carried on with their lives amid extraordinary circumstances. When the Revolution finally ended in 1783, British forces departed the city. The long conflict was over. New York had survived years of uncertainty and emerged as part of a new nation. Few could have known what lay ahead. The young United States faced enormous challenges, but New York was well positioned for future growth. Its harbor, its merchants, and its diverse population would help shape the next chapter of American history. As evening settles over the city in the years following the Revolution, lanterns flicker along the streets and waterfront. Ships rest quietly in the harbor. The war is over. A new nation has been born, and New York stands ready to enter a remarkable new era. As the 18th century drew to a close, New York entered a new chapter in its history. The American Revolution was over. The colonies had gained independence, and the United States had become a new nation. For New York, the years ahead would bring extraordinary growth. The city had survived war and uncertainty, but its greatest advantage remained unchanged. Its harbor. The deep, sheltered waters that had first attracted Dutch traders continued to connect New York to the rest of the world. Ships arrived daily carrying goods, passengers, and news from distant places. The waterfront buzzed with activity as merchants looked toward a future filled with opportunity. For a brief period, New York even served as the capital of the United States. In 1789, the nation's first president, George Washington, took the oath of office in New York. At the time, the city was the center of the young nation's government. Although the capital would later move to other locations, New Yorkers took pride in their role during the country's earliest years. As the 19th century began, the city's population continued to rise. People arrived from nearby towns, neighboring states, and overseas. Some came seeking work. Others hoped to start businesses or build new lives. The growing city offered possibilities that were difficult to find elsewhere. Much of Manhattan still looked very different from today. The southern portion of the island was developed, but farther north there were farms, fields, forests, and country estates. Traveling uptown often meant passing through open land rather than city streets. Yet change was already underway. New roads were constructed. Homes and businesses spread gradually northward. Areas that had once been rural began transforming into neighborhoods. The harbor remained the engine driving much of this growth. New York became a major center for international trade. Merchants bought and sold goods from around the globe. Warehouses lined the waterfront. Shipbuilders constructed vessels for commerce and travel. The city's economy expanded alongside its population. One area that grew especially important was Wall Street. Long after the original Dutch wall had disappeared, the street bearing its name evolved into a center of finance. Banks, investors, and merchants gathered there to conduct business. In 1792, a group of traders signed an agreement that helped establish what would eventually become the New York Stock Exchange. At the time, few could have imagined the global financial influence the area would one day possess. Life in the growing city remained busy, but far slower than modern New York. Most people traveled on foot. Horse-drawn wagons carried goods through the streets. Ferries transported passengers across rivers and harbors. The sounds of hoofbeats, ship bells, and market vendors filled the air. Markets remained important gathering places. Farmers brought produce into the city. Fishermen sold their catches. Merchants displayed imported goods from distant lands. The city increasingly served as a meeting point between local communities and the wider world. As the decades passed, immigration accelerated. New arrivals brought languages, customs, foods, and traditions from across Europe. The city's population became more diverse with each passing year. Different cultures mixed within neighborhoods, markets, workplaces, and places of worship. This diversity helped shape the unique character of New York. Growth also brought challenges. Crowded housing became more common. Streets required maintenance. Public services had to expand to meet the needs of a larger population. City leaders worked to improve infrastructure and manage the demands of rapid development. Even so, opportunities continued to attract newcomers. By the early 1800s, New York was competing with other American cities for economic importance. Ports such as Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore remained significant centers of trade. Yet New York possessed several advantages. Its harbor was excellent. Its merchants were ambitious. Its location provided access to both Atlantic trade routes and the growing interior of North America. These strengths helped the city expand faster than many of its rivals. Every year brought more ships, more businesses, more residents. The pace of growth steadily increased. The city that had once been a small Dutch trading post was becoming one of the most important urban centers in the United States. Still, much of the future remained uncertain. The skyscrapers that would someday define Manhattan did not yet exist. Central Park had not been created. The famous skyline remained far beyond the imagination of most residents. Yet the foundations were being laid. The harbor continued to welcome ships from around the world. The population continued to rise. Commerce flourished, and New York's influence expanded far beyond its shoreline. As evening settles over the city in the early 19th century, lanterns flicker along the streets and waterfront. Ships rest quietly at their docks after long voyages. Merchants finish their accounts. Families gather in homes throughout the growing city. New York is larger than ever before, but its greatest transformation is still ahead. As the 19th century began, New York was growing rapidly. More ships were arriving in the harbor. More people were settling in the city. New businesses appeared every year, and neighborhoods continued spreading northward across Manhattan Island. Yet despite this growth, much of Manhattan remained undeveloped. Beyond the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan were farms, forests, rocky hills, streams, and open fields. For generations, the landscape had followed the natural contours of the island. Roads often wound around hills and property lines. Paths developed gradually as people traveled between homes, farms, and villages. But city leaders knew that Manhattan would not remain rural forever. They believed the island would continue to grow, and they wanted a plan for the future. That plan arrived in 1811. Known today as the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, it would become one of the most influential urban planning projects in history. The idea was surprisingly simple. Rather than allowing streets to develop organically over time, planners proposed covering most of Manhattan with a carefully organized grid. Straight avenues would run north and south. Straight streets would run east and west. Together, they would create hundreds of rectangular city blocks. Today, this arrangement feels completely natural to anyone familiar with Manhattan. But at the time, it was a bold vision. The plan ignored many of the island's natural features. Hills, valleys, streams, and rocky outcroppings were largely treated as obstacles to be removed or reshaped. The goal was not to preserve the existing landscape. The goal was to prepare for a future city. Surveyors were tasked with translating the plan onto the island itself. Imagine the scene. Men carrying measuring tools crossed fields and forests. They climbed rocky ridges and moved through open countryside. Using chains, markers, and careful calculations, they mapped out future streets that existed only on paper. Many of these future roads stretched through empty farmland. At the time, it must have been difficult to imagine rows of buildings standing where cows grazed and crops grew. Yet the surveyors continued their work. Line by line, block by block, they were helping create the framework for a city that would one day house millions of people. Not everyone supported the plan. Some landowners objected when future streets crossed their property. Others disliked the rigid design. They argued that the grid ignored the natural beauty of the island. In some places, hills would need to be leveled and streams redirected. The landscape itself would be transformed. Despite these objections, the plan moved forward. As the years passed, development followed the grid. New streets appeared. New homes were constructed. Businesses expanded northward. Areas that had once seemed distant from the city gradually became part of it. The transformation happened slowly at first. Then it accelerated. Every decade brought more residents and more construction. The harbor continued attracting immigrants, merchants, and entrepreneurs. As the population grew, the need for additional housing and infrastructure increased. The grid provided a clear blueprint for expansion. Builders knew where future streets would go. Property owners could divide land into predictable lots. Transportation became easier to organize. The system created order within a rapidly growing city. By modern standards, the grid may seem ordinary, yet it played a crucial role in shaping New York's future. Many cities evolved through centuries of winding roads and irregular layouts. Manhattan, by contrast, developed according to a remarkably consistent plan. The numbered streets and avenues that millions of people navigate today trace their origins back to the decisions made in 1811. At the same time, traces of the old landscape did not disappear entirely. Certain roads that predated the grid survived. One of the most famous was Broadway. Unlike the straight avenues surrounding it, Broadway followed an older route that stretched diagonally across the island. As Manhattan grew, Broadway remained, cutting across the orderly grid and creating many of the unusual intersections that still exist today. The city's expansion also brought dramatic physical changes. Workers leveled hills, filled wetlands, moved enormous amounts of earth and stone. Streams that had once flowed freely were buried beneath developing streets. Entire sections of the natural landscape disappeared beneath buildings and roads. To modern visitors, it can be difficult to imagine how different Manhattan once looked. The rocky countryside described by early travelers gradually gave way to a dense urban environment. Yet beneath the pavement and skyscrapers, traces of the original island still remain. The bedrock formed during the Ice Age continues to support the city above it. As New York expanded northward, its future became increasingly clear. The city was no longer simply a busy port. It was becoming a major urban center. The framework established by the grid plan allowed growth on a scale that few could have imagined only decades earlier. Every new building, every new neighborhood, every new street, all became part of a vision created long before much of Manhattan was developed. As evening falls over Manhattan in the early 19th century, survey markers stand in fields where future streets will one day run. Farmhouses sit quietly beneath the stars. The city still occupies only part of the island. Yet on maps and planning documents, the future is already taking shape. The forests and farms are slowly giving way to a new landscape. A landscape of streets, avenues, and city blocks. A landscape that will become one of the most recognizable urban environments in the world. By the early 19th century, New York was growing faster than ever before. The harbor was crowded with ships. New streets stretched northward across Manhattan. Businesses expanded, neighborhoods grew, and opportunities seemed to multiply with each passing year. Yet one of the most important forces shaping the city was not a building, a road, or a business. It was people. Thousands of people were arriving from overseas, hoping to build new lives in America. For many immigrants, New York was their first glimpse of the United States. After weeks crossing the Atlantic Ocean, passengers would gather on the decks of ships as the coastline came into view. Ahead lay a busy harbor, a growing city, and the promise of new beginnings. The journey was often difficult. Many immigrants traveled in crowded conditions. Storms, seasickness, and uncertainty accompanied them throughout the voyage. Yet despite these hardships, millions continued making the journey. They came seeking opportunity. Some hoped to find work. Others sought land, religious freedom, or a chance to escape poverty and political instability. For many, New York represented hope. One of the largest groups arriving during the mid-19th century came from Ireland. In the 1840s, Ireland experienced a devastating potato famine that caused widespread hunger and hardship. Faced with difficult conditions at home, many Irish families chose to emigrate. Large numbers arrived in New York Harbor, carrying few possessions but hoping for a better future. At roughly the same time, immigrants from Germany also began arriving in significant numbers. Some came seeking economic opportunity, while others left Europe after political unrest and failed revolutions during the late 1840s. Together, Irish and German immigrants transformed the city's population. Neighborhoods developed where newcomers could find familiar languages, foods, customs, and places of worship. These communities helped recent arrivals adapt to life in a new country. The city became increasingly diverse. Walking through New York during this period, you might hear conversations in English, German, Irish dialects, Dutch, Italian, and many other languages. Different cultures mixed together in markets, workplaces, churches, and neighborhoods. The streets reflected traditions from around the world. Many immigrants settled in tenement housing. These apartment buildings allowed large numbers of people to live close to jobs and transportation. Although tenements provided affordable housing, living conditions were often crowded. Entire families sometimes occupied only a few rooms. Buildings were packed closely together, and basic services struggled to keep pace with the city's rapid growth. Yet despite the challenges, many immigrants worked hard to establish stable lives. Men found employment on docks, construction projects, factories, and railroads. Women often worked as domestic servants, seamstresses, cooks, or in family businesses. Children frequently contributed to household income through various jobs. Life was rarely easy, but opportunities existed that many families believed were unavailable in their homelands. The waterfront remained at the center of this story. Ships arrived almost daily carrying new passengers. Before the opening of Ellis Island later in the century, many immigrants entered through a facility known as Castle Garden. Located at the southern tip of Manhattan, Castle Garden became America's first official immigrant processing center. There, newcomers received information, assistance, and guidance as they entered their new country. For some, New York became their permanent home. For others, it was only the beginning of a longer journey. Many continued westward, settling in towns and cities across the United States. Yet even those who moved elsewhere often passed through New York first. The city became known as the gateway to America. As immigration increased, New York's population exploded. In 1820, the city had fewer than 125,000 residents. By the middle of the century, that number had grown dramatically. Every year brought more arrivals. More homes were needed. More businesses opened. More streets were built. The city expanded in nearly every direction possible. New Yorkers also began encountering foods, traditions, music, and celebrations from around the world. Irish communities established churches and social organizations. German immigrants opened bakeries, restaurants, and breweries. Different cultural traditions became part of the city's daily life. Over time, these influences blended together, helping create the unique character for which New York would become famous. Not everyone welcomed immigration. Periods of tension occasionally emerged as competition for jobs and housing increased. Some residents worried about how quickly the city was changing. Yet despite these challenges, immigration remained one of the driving forces behind New York's growth. The city continued attracting newcomers because it offered possibilities. A person arriving with very little could still hope to build a better future through hard work and perseverance. By the late 19th century, New York had become one of the largest and most diverse cities in the world. Its streets were crowded with people from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds. The city was no longer simply an American port. It had become an international crossroads. As evening settles over New York in the mid-1800s, lamps begin to glow along busy streets. Families gather in apartments and boarding houses. New arrivals unpack their belongings and imagine what the future might hold. Outside, ships continue arriving in the harbor, carrying thousands more dreamers toward a new life. The city grows larger with every passing year, and its greatest period of expansion is still ahead. By the middle of the 19th century, New York City was changing at an extraordinary pace. Immigration had increased the population dramatically. New neighborhoods were forming across Manhattan. Streets were extending farther north, replacing open land with rows of buildings. Life in the city was becoming faster, denser, and more crowded. And as New York grew upward and outward, a new concern began to emerge. There were fewer places left for quiet, open space. For many residents, especially those living in crowded districts, daily life took place almost entirely among buildings, streets, and noise. In response to this growing condition, a new idea began to take shape. The idea of a large public park in the center of Manhattan, a place designed not for commerce or transportation, but for rest, nature, and shared public life. In the 1850s, city planners identified a large tract of land in the middle of the island. At the time, this land was far from the carefully maintained landscape it would eventually become. It consisted of uneven terrain, rocky outcrops, wetlands, and small settlements. Many people saw it as difficult land to develop, but others saw something different. They saw potential for something entirely new in an American city. Instead of dividing the land into building lots, the city made an unusual decision. They reserved it for a park, a space that would belong to the public. To determine its design, the city held a competition inviting landscape architects and planners to submit proposals. The winning design came from Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. Their vision was not for a formal or symmetrical park. Instead, they proposed a naturalistic landscape, curving paths instead of straight roads, open meadows instead of rigid grids, waterways and wooded areas designed to feel as though they had always existed. Even though every part of the park would be carefully constructed, the goal was to create the impression of untouched nature within the city. Construction began in the late 1850s. The process was extensive and labor-intensive. Workers reshaped the land on a massive scale. Rock was blasted and removed. Swamps were drained. Soil was transported to level and raise different areas. Hills were formed. Valleys were created. Nothing about the landscape was left untouched. At the same time, New York continued to grow around the site. Streets expanded northward. Buildings rose closer to the park's edges. The city and the park developed side by side, each transforming the other in different ways. As construction progressed, the design of the park began to take shape. Winding pathways connected different sections of land. Open lawns provided space for gathering and quiet rest. Bridges crossed over roads and water features, blending into the landscape rather than dominating it. Small lakes were created, reflecting the sky and surrounding trees. Even though the park was entirely designed and constructed, it was intended to feel natural and unplanned, a place where visitors could step away from the intensity of the city without leaving it entirely. Once sections of the park opened to the public, New Yorkers quickly began to use it in many different ways. People came to walk slowly along the paths. Families gathered on the grass for picnics and conversation. Horse-drawn carriages traveled along designated routes, carrying visitors through scenic views. Boats moved across the lakes in quiet rhythm. Musicians sometimes performed in open areas, their sound softened by trees and distance. For many residents, the park offered something rare in the city, a sense of calm, a sense of space, a place where life did not feel rushed. Over time, the park became more than just a landscaped area. It became a shared public environment, a space where people from different neighborhoods and backgrounds could experience the city in a slower and more peaceful way. Children played in open fields. Workers rested after long hours of labor. Visitors explored new paths and views with each visit. Meanwhile, the city around the park continued to grow rapidly. Buildings became taller. Streets became busier. New technologies changed how people lived and worked. But the park remained a stable contrast to all of this change. Low and open against the rising skyline. Quiet against the sound of industry. Green against the spread of stone and brick. By the late 19th century, this park had become one of the most recognizable public spaces in the United States. A carefully designed landscape that offered balance within an increasingly crowded city. As evening settles over Manhattan, the park grows quieter. Paths empty slowly as visitors return home. Light fades across the trees and water, and for a moment, in the center of one of the largest cities in the world, there is stillness, a reminder that even in a place defined by movement and growth, there can also be space to rest. By the late 19th century, New York City was changing in ways that would have been difficult to imagine only a few decades earlier. The population had continued to grow. Immigrants arrived in large numbers. Businesses expanded rapidly, and the streets of Manhattan became increasingly crowded with people, horses, carts, and new forms of transportation. But perhaps the most striking change was not on the ground at all. It was happening above it. For the first time in the city's history, New York began to rise upward. The limits of land on a narrow island had always shaped how the city developed. But by this period, those limits were becoming more pronounced. Space was scarce, and demand was high. As a result, a new kind of building began to appear. Structures that reached higher than anything seen before in the city. This shift was made possible by important innovations in construction. Steel frame building methods allowed structures to support greater height without relying on thick stone walls. At the same time, the introduction of passenger elevators made upper floors practical for everyday use. For the first time, it became possible for people to live and work comfortably far above the street. The city was no longer just expanding outward. It was expanding upward. This new style of building would come to define what we now call the skyscraper. At street level, however, life continued much as it had before. The roads were still busy with horses, carts, and pedestrians. Merchants still called out to customers. Workers moved through the streets each morning and evening in steady patterns. But above this familiar activity, something new was forming. Entire floors of offices, filled with clerks, accountants, and business operations, now existed high above the ground. Windows looked out across rooftops and waterways. Light entered rooms from elevated heights that had once been unimaginable. The city was developing a vertical dimension that added an entirely new layer to daily life. While buildings were rising, another transformation was taking place across the East River. For much of New York's early history, Manhattan and Brooklyn had been connected primarily by ferries. These crossings were essential, but they were also limited. Weather, distance, and capacity often affected travel between the two growing cities. As both sides continued to expand, the need for a permanent connection became more urgent. This need led to one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 19th century, the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. The original design was created by engineer John A. Roebling. After his death early in the project, responsibility for construction passed to his son, Washington Roebling. Work on the bridge was difficult and dangerous. Massive stone towers were built on either side of the river. Steel cables were carefully stretched across the water. Workers labored at great heights and under challenging conditions. Progress was slow, and the project took more than a decade to complete. But when the bridge finally opened in 1883, it represented something far greater than a new way to cross the river. It symbolized connection. For the first time, Manhattan and Brooklyn were permanently linked by a structure that allowed continuous movement between them. What had once been separate communities were now part of a shared urban system. With this connection in place, movement across the city increased dramatically. Trade expanded. Commuting became more common. Neighborhoods on both sides of the river grew closer in daily life. At the same time, Manhattan itself continued to develop rapidly. Lower Manhattan, especially the area around Wall Street, became a center of finance and commerce. Large institutions and businesses began to shape the identity of the district. New buildings rose to accommodate this growth, many of them taller than anything previously constructed. This period of rapid expansion and wealth creation is often referred to as the Gilded Age. It was a time of great economic growth and technological progress. Wealth accumulated quickly, industries expanded, and cities like New York became central to the nation's economy. But it was also a time of contrast. While some individuals and institutions became extremely wealthy, many workers lived in crowded conditions and worked long hours to sustain the city's growth. Luxury and hardship existed side by side, often within the same neighborhoods. As the city modernized, new technologies began to change everyday life. Electric lighting slowly replaced gas lamps in many areas, allowing activity to continue later into the night. Elevated railways and streetcars made it easier for people to travel longer distances within the city. Department stores introduced new forms of shopping, where goods from many places were gathered under one roof. These changes made New York faster, more connected, and more complex than ever before. The skyline itself began to reflect these transformations. Tall buildings rose above the streets, visible from great distances, signaling the city's growing ambition and confidence. By the end of the 19th century, New York had become one of the largest and most influential cities in the world. It was no longer just a port of arrival or a center of trade. It was a metropolis defined by movement, innovation, and constant change. As evening settles over the city during this period, light begins to glow from windows high above the streets. Bridges stretch across dark water, carrying steady movement between boroughs. And beneath it all, the city continues its quiet rhythm of growth. By the late 19th century, New York City had already become one of the largest and most diverse cities in the world. Its population continued to grow at a rapid pace, driven largely by immigration. Ships arrived daily in New York Harbor, carrying thousands of people from across Europe and other parts of the world. For many of these passengers, the journey across the Atlantic had been long and difficult. Weeks at sea were often spent in crowded conditions, with limited privacy, uncertain weather, and constant anticipation of what lay ahead. Yet despite these hardships, millions continued to make the journey, because New York represented possibility, a chance to begin again. In 1892, a new immigration station opened in New York Harbor. It was called Ellis Island, and it quickly became the primary entry point for immigrants arriving in the United States. Located near the Statue of Liberty, it stood as the first place many newcomers would step onto American soil. After ships entered the harbor, passengers were ferried to the island for inspection and processing. For many, this moment marked the true arrival in a new world. The experience at Ellis Island was often overwhelming. Large crowds gathered inside the main building, and the air was filled with dozens of languages spoken at once. Officials moved continuously through the halls, guiding people through a structured but intense process. The first step was a medical inspection. Doctors observed each immigrant quickly, checking for visible signs of illness or conditions that might prevent entry. Clothing, posture, and physical movement were all noted in brief but careful examinations. In some cases, individuals were marked for further review. After medical inspection came the legal examination. Officials reviewed documents, asked questions about identity, origin, and intended destination, and determined whether each person could enter the country. For many, this process was brief, and they were allowed to continue into the United States within a short time. For others, additional questioning or observation was required. A small number were detained or sent back if they did not meet entry requirements. But for most, Ellis Island was not a place of rejection. It was a place of transition, a short pause between one life and the next. The people who passed through Ellis Island came from many different regions of the world. Large numbers arrived from Ireland, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Eastern Europe, along with immigrants from Scandinavia and other parts of southern and central Europe. Each group brought its own language, traditions, and cultural practices. Some arrived alone, hoping to earn enough money to bring their families later. Others came with relatives or joined family members already living in the United States. Many carried only small bundles of belongings, yet almost all carried the same intention: to build a more stable and hopeful future. After leaving Ellis Island, immigrants entered New York City itself, which for many was overwhelming in both scale and intensity. The streets were crowded, buildings stood closely packed together, and the sounds of carts, voices, and industry filled the air at all hours. Despite this, the city also offered opportunity. Work could be found in factories, on docks, in construction, and in small businesses scattered throughout the city. Although conditions were often difficult and wages modest, these jobs provided a path forward for many families who had come with very little. Housing was typically found in tenement neighborhoods, where buildings were densely packed and apartments were small. Families often lived in tight quarters, sometimes sharing limited space with multiple households. Conditions could be difficult, with limited ventilation and basic services struggling to keep pace with rapid population growth. Still, these neighborhoods became important centers of community life. Immigrants often settled near others from the same country or region, creating enclaves where familiar languages and traditions could continue. Irish neighborhoods developed in some districts, Italian communities in others, along with German, Jewish, and many additional groups across the city. Within these neighborhoods, daily life reflected both adaptation and continuity. Markets, bakeries, and small shops carried foods and goods from home countries. Churches, synagogues, and social organizations helped newcomers build support networks. Over time, the city became a place where many cultures existed side by side, and where daily life was shaped by a wide range of traditions and languages. Walking through New York during this period, it would not have been unusual to hear several different languages spoken within a single block. At times, this rapid change also created tension. Competition for jobs and housing could lead to strain between different groups, and some long-term residents worried about how quickly the city was changing. But despite these challenges, immigration continued steadily, because New York still offered opportunities that were difficult to find elsewhere. Even when life was hard, many believed it could still lead to something better than what they had left behind. Over the years, Ellis Island processed millions of people. Each one passed through the same rooms, the same inspections, and the same moment of arrival into a new country. Some remained in New York permanently, building lives within the city's growing neighborhoods. Others traveled onward to towns and cities across the United States, carrying their experiences with them. But almost all passed through New York first, making the city a central gateway to America. As evening settled over New York Harbor, ships continued to arrive in the distance, their lights appearing slowly through the mist. Along the waterfront, the city glowed softly, already shaped by generations of arrivals. And in that steady rhythm of movement and change, New York continued to grow larger, not just through buildings or bridges, but through the constant flow of people who came to it from across the world. By the early 20th century, New York City had fully entered a new era of modern life. The skyline was taller than ever before. Bridges and subway lines connected neighborhoods across the city. Electric lights illuminated streets that once would have fallen into darkness after sunset, and the pace of life continued to accelerate. But in the 1920s, something else began to define New York: a sense of energy, optimism, and rapid cultural change. This period became known as the Roaring Twenties. In neighborhoods across Manhattan and beyond, new forms of music, entertainment, and social life emerged. Jazz music filled clubs and dance halls, carrying rhythms that felt fast, lively, and modern. People gathered in theaters, restaurants, and public spaces that stayed active late into the night. The city seemed to move with a new kind of confidence. Construction also continued at a remarkable pace. Skyscrapers rose higher than ever before, competing to define the skyline. Office workers filled the growing financial district, especially around Wall Street, where economic activity expanded rapidly. New York became not only a center of commerce, but also a symbol of modern ambition. During this time, the construction of the Empire State Building marked one of the most recognizable achievements of the era. Rising quickly in the early 1930s, it became a defining feature of the skyline, representing both engineering progress and the city's desire to reach upward without limit. But beneath the energy and growth of the 1920s, deeper economic forces were shifting. The financial system was becoming increasingly unstable, and speculation in the stock market was rising. In 1929, these pressures came to a sudden turning point. The stock market crashed. What had seemed like endless growth quickly gave way to widespread economic hardship. This marked the beginning of the Great Depression. Across New York City, the effects were immediate and far-reaching. Businesses closed or reduced operations. Factories slowed production. Many workers lost their jobs or faced reduced wages. Families across the city struggled to afford housing, food, and basic necessities. The optimism of the previous decade gave way to uncertainty. In neighborhoods throughout the city, daily life became more difficult. Long lines formed outside employment offices. Public assistance programs expanded as more people sought support. Even in a city known for opportunity, hardship became a shared experience. Yet even during this difficult period, the city did not stop functioning. New York continued to move, though more slowly and under heavier strain. Public works projects were introduced to create employment. Roads, bridges, and infrastructure improvements provided work for thousands of residents. Construction did not disappear entirely, but it shifted in purpose, focusing more on recovery than expansion. The Empire State Building, completed during the early years of the Depression, stood as a striking symbol of this contradiction. Built during a time of widespread economic struggle, it rose into the skyline as one of the tallest structures in the world, reflecting both ambition and resilience. At street level, life during the Depression was defined by adjustment. Families made difficult decisions about spending and housing. Communities relied on mutual support, and local networks became essential for survival. Public spaces, including parks and libraries, remained important places of gathering. Even in hardship, they provided moments of relief from daily pressures. Over time, gradual recovery began to take shape. Federal programs and economic changes slowly helped stabilize conditions. While the Depression would last for years, it did not define the city permanently. By the late 1930s, signs of recovery were becoming visible again. Construction projects resumed more steadily. Employment began to improve, and the city started to regain a sense of forward movement. Through it all, New York continued to evolve. The Roaring Twenties had shown its capacity for rapid growth, cultural change, and architectural ambition. The Great Depression had revealed its vulnerabilities, but also its resilience. Together, these years marked a turning point in the city's modern history. As evening settles over New York at the end of this era, the skyline remains illuminated, even in times of difficulty. Some lights are fewer than before, but they are still present. And across the streets, bridges, and rivers, the city continues to endure, carrying forward its history of change, challenge, and renewal. By the middle of the 20th century, New York City had already lived through centuries of transformation. It had grown from a small colonial trading port into one of the largest and most influential cities in the world. It had expanded upward into a skyline of steel and stone, outward into 5 boroughs, and inward into the daily lives of millions of people from around the globe. And as the world changed after the Second World War, New York entered a new phase of its history, a modern era shaped by global influence, cultural change, and an ever-evolving urban landscape. In the years following the war, the city experienced renewed growth. Returning soldiers, expanding industries, and a strong national economy contributed to a period of development across many neighborhoods. New housing projects were constructed, suburban areas expanded beyond the city, and infrastructure systems were modernized to support a growing population. New York remained a central hub for finance, shipping, and international trade, but it was also becoming something more, a center of global culture. During this period, new forms of media began to reshape how people experienced the world. Television became a dominant force in American households, and New York played a major role in its development. Broadcast studios, advertising agencies, and production companies established themselves in the city, turning it into a national center for news and entertainment. For many Americans, images and stories from New York entered their homes daily. The city was no longer only experienced in person. It was experienced through screens, voices, and broadcasts. At the same time, New York's cultural life continued to evolve. Theaters on Broadway expanded their influence, presenting new forms of musical and dramatic performance that attracted audiences from around the world. Jazz continued to develop, and new musical styles began to emerge from the city's diverse neighborhoods. Art, literature, and fashion also found a strong presence in New York, where creative communities formed in areas such as Greenwich Village and later Soho. These neighborhoods became known for artistic experimentation and cultural exchange. Immigration also continued during this period, though patterns began to shift. New arrivals came from different regions of the world, including Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, and the Middle East, adding new layers to the city's already diverse population. Each group brought its own traditions, languages, and cultural practices, continuing the long history of New York as a city shaped by global migration. Neighborhoods evolved once again in response to these changes. Restaurants, markets, and community centers reflected the growing diversity of the population. Languages from around the world could be heard in schools, streets, and workplaces across all 5 boroughs. While Manhattan remained a center of business and finance, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island each developed their own distinct identities within the larger city. Transportation systems also played a key role in shaping modern life. The subway system, already established in earlier decades, continued to expand and serve millions of daily riders. Bridges and tunnels connected boroughs more efficiently than ever before, making movement across the city a routine part of daily life for many residents. Despite these advancements, the city also faced challenges. Economic shifts in the mid to late 20th century led to periods of difficulty, including industrial decline in some areas and financial strain in others. Certain neighborhoods experienced population loss and reduced investment, while others continued to grow and adapt. During the 1970s, New York faced a particularly difficult period marked by fiscal crisis, rising crime rates, and economic uncertainty. Public services were strained, and parts of the city experienced visible decline. Yet even during this time, the city did not stop evolving. Communities remained active. Cultural movements continued, and in many neighborhoods, local efforts helped maintain stability and resilience. Out of these challenges also came new forms of creativity. Music, art, and performance continued to develop in unexpected places, reflecting both the struggles and energy of urban life. By the 1980s and 1990s, New York began to experience another period of recovery and reinvention. Economic restructuring shifted the city more heavily toward finance, technology, and global business services. The skyline continued to change as new office towers and residential buildings were constructed. Tourism also grew significantly, as visitors from around the world came to experience the city's landmarks, museums, and cultural institutions. Places such as Central Park, Times Square, the Statue of Liberty, and the Brooklyn Bridge became internationally recognized symbols of the city. At the same time, neighborhoods continued to evolve. Gentrification, redevelopment, and demographic change reshaped many areas, reflecting ongoing shifts in population and economy. Through all of this, New York remained a city defined by constant motion. Change was not an exception here. It was a pattern. As the 20th century came to a close and the 21st century began, New York stood as a global city in every sense. A place connected to international finance, media, culture, and migration. A place where millions of people lived, worked, and moved through daily life in complex and interconnected ways. The events of the early 21st century brought new challenges and changes, further shaping the city's identity. In response, New York continued to rebuild, adapt, and redefine itself, once again demonstrating a long history of resilience in the face of disruption. As night falls over the modern city, its skyline stretches across the horizon in layers of light and reflection. Subways move beneath the streets. Airplanes cross above the towers. And across the boroughs, millions of individual lives continue their daily rhythms. The city is no longer only a national center. It is a global one. And yet, despite all of its change, it remains rooted in the same place it began. A harbor, an island, and a continuous flow of people shaping its story. After centuries of change, New York City now stands as one of the most recognizable places in the world. It is no longer defined by a single era, or a single transformation, or even a single identity. Instead, it is defined by continuity, a steady accumulation of history, layered over time, still visible in its streets, its buildings, and its people. Today, New York is made up of 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. Each one has its own character, its own neighborhoods, and its own daily rhythm, yet all remain part of the same interconnected city. Millions of people live and work here, moving through an environment shaped by centuries of growth. Transportation plays a central role in daily life. The subway system carries passengers beneath the city at all hours, connecting distant neighborhoods through a vast network of underground routes. Bridges and tunnels link boroughs across rivers and waterways, making movement across the city constant and routine. Above ground, buses, taxis, bicycles, and pedestrians fill the streets, creating a continuous flow of movement that rarely fully stops. Even at night, New York does not truly become still. Lights remain on in apartments, offices, restaurants, and storefronts. The phrase, "the city that never sleeps," reflects not only its energy, but its constant activity across all hours of the day. At the center of the city's identity is its diversity. People from nearly every part of the world now call New York home. Immigration continues to shape its neighborhoods, bringing new languages, traditions, foods, and cultural practices into daily life. Walking through different parts of the city, it is possible to experience many cultures within a single journey. Markets filled with international foods. Restaurants representing dozens of culinary traditions. Community centers, places of worship, and local businesses reflecting global influences. This diversity is not separate from the city's identity. It is the city's identity. Each generation adds to a long history of migration that began centuries ago and continues today. The city's cultural life remains equally dynamic. Museums preserve art and history from across the world. Broadway continues to attract performers and audiences from around the globe. Music, film, fashion, and literature all find expression in New York's creative environment. Neighborhoods that once served as entry points for immigrants have evolved over time, but many still retain traces of their original communities while adapting to new populations. Financial institutions remain a defining part of the city's global role. Lower Manhattan continues to serve as a major center of finance and business, with Wall Street symbolizing the city's connection to international markets. At the same time, technology, media, and innovation have become increasingly important parts of the modern economy. New industries now operate alongside long-established ones, continuing the city's pattern of reinvention. The skyline itself reflects this ongoing evolution. Skyscrapers from different eras stand together, each representing a different moment in architectural and economic history. Older stone and steel buildings remain alongside modern glass towers that rise even higher into the sky. This layered skyline mirrors the city itself, constantly rebuilt but never erased. Parks and public spaces remain essential to daily life. Central Park continues to serve as a place of rest and movement within Manhattan, offering green space in the middle of dense urban surroundings. Smaller parks across the boroughs provide similar spaces for recreation, reflection, and community gatherings. Waterfront areas, once dominated by industrial activity, have been transformed in many places into walkways, residential spaces, and public parks. Despite its scale and complexity, life in New York often revolves around ordinary daily moments. Commuting to work, meeting friends, attending school, shopping at neighborhood stores, walking through familiar streets that change slowly over time. These everyday routines form the foundation of the city's experience. At the same time, New York continues to face challenges. Housing costs remain high in many areas. Economic inequality is visible across neighborhoods. Infrastructure requires constant maintenance and adaptation, and like all major cities, it must continually respond to social, environmental, and economic pressures. Yet throughout its history, New York has repeatedly shown an ability to adjust and transform. Neighborhoods evolve, industries shift, populations change, and still, the city continues to function as a connected whole. It is shaped not by permanence, but by motion. As the day turns into night across the 5 boroughs, the city takes on its familiar rhythm. Trains continue running beneath the streets. Bridges remain illuminated across dark water. Airplanes trace paths across the sky above the skyline. And in apartments, offices, and public spaces, millions of individual lives continue moving forward, each one part of a larger system that never fully pauses. New York today is not a finished story. It is an ongoing one, a city built from centuries of arrivals, departures, construction, and reinvention. From Lenape homelands to Dutch trading posts, from colonial streets to immigrant neighborhoods, from early skyscrapers to modern towers of glass and steel, all layered together in one continuous place. And as the lights of the city stretch across the horizon, there is a quiet sense of continuity beneath it all, a reminder that while New York constantly changes, it never stops becoming something new. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the history of New York City. From quiet forests and rivers shaped by glaciers, to the arrival of the first explorers, from small trading posts along the harbor to one of the largest and most complex cities in the world, we have watched centuries of change unfold layer by layer. Every era added something new. Every generation left its mark. And through it all, the city continued to grow, adapt, and reshape itself again and again. Now, as we reach the present day, we can step back for a moment and simply imagine it all together, the winding story of a place that is always moving, always changing, and always alive. So as you settle in for sleep, you can let the city fade gently into the background. The sound of distant streets, the glow of lights across the water, the steady rhythm of a place that never quite stops, even as the world around it rests. And now, so can you. Thank you for spending this time with this story. Good night.